We're just going to get started in a minute here. We're getting closer to the start time than I normally do. Normally I start a couple minutes early, let folks trickle in, then actually get into the lesson around 5 o'clock. But take me a minute or two and I'll let folks trickle in as usual. Yeah, how's everybody doing? Everybody having a good time? Oh, Tennessee Feet Monk, good to see you again. Did anybody go to Planetary Qualifiers this weekend? I was up in Montreal with the face-to-face one, and that was a good time. I had a lot of fun with that. Players had a good time. Top 8 was a little skewed towards Boba. I think the metric is 88% Boba in the top 8, which is maybe not indicative of balance for him, but it was for variations of Boba. I was judging. I was the head judge of the Montreal PQ. The one standout was a Tarkin Town Ray, but we had, I think, 3 yellows, 2 greens, an ECL, and a Tarkin Town Boba. Hey Noxum, hey Zephymeg. How's folks doing? I am, as always, juggling things. Everybody is shocked to find out that I'm busier than I should be. Tennessee Feet Monk, I got to recommend myself as head judge. You need an adult. So okay, we're going to pull back the curtain a little bit. Back in, I don't know, May or maybe June, the tournament organizer for face-to-face games reached out to me and was like, hey, if you're available this weekend in October, keep your calendar clear. I think I have an event you'll really enjoy. And I was like, okay, sounds fine to me, because I've worked with face-to-face for their Magic events for a while. I don't know how often. But I occasionally do some stuff for them. And then I became the judge manager, and I got the schedule of events, and I looked at the schedule and saw that there's a face-to-face event on the same day that he had asked me to be available. And I was like, you know what? I think I am qualified for this. I wrote the exam, I wrote the evaluation, so I scored perfectly, in my opinion. And one of the things that we were looking for in applications, particularly for head judges, is folks who had worked with the store before or knew the local community. It's really important that judges and organizers are able to work together well. And so I knew that was something that I could offer, and I know that it's something that some other folks who were head judges for various PQs or will be head judges for various PQs can offer. McFerguson, do typos on the exam count against me? I'm so glad you're back. I'm so glad you could catch me in a live stream and just call me out with everything I say. I really appreciate to see you here. And yes, they do count against me probably, and saying that things are tokens when they're counters or counters when they're tokens, and calling things... I didn't call anything a creature, okay? I didn't call anything a creature, and I've generally avoided calling things creatures, and I'm very proud of myself for that. But enough nonsense, let's dive in. Today we're going to be covering both the master event document, and then we're going to talk about how we take calls. This presentation, the next one, in the lessons that you'll see on the site, I'm making excuses now. I have the videos of me talking. Those apparently caused lag on the Twitch side, so I deleted all of them, so the slides are going to be a little bit more boring than usual. I'm deeply apologetic. I wish that we had something pretty for you to look at on the screen as I'm talking rather than just words. But hey, we're going to bring up those bullet points and dive right into the MED. So, let's talk about the master event document. The master event document is a pretty complex and large document, and it's not something that we're going to cover in depth for level 1. We're going to cover a little bit, we're going to go over a bunch of stuff, but the master event document is designed for competitive tier events, and level 1 is designed for casual tier events. Casual tier events have more flexibility, and so the guidelines laid out in the Master Event Doc or the MED or the MED are, there's a little bit more flexibility in how you regard them. Some of the philosophies and ideas espoused in the Master Event document are things that we're going to want to follow. But sometimes you'll lean away from the MED a little bit more at casual tier than you would at a competitive event, because there's more of an emphasis on education and the enjoyment of the game than a strict competitive feeling. We want to make sure that people are having fun, first and foremost, and maintaining a fair environment is critical to that, but anything that harkens to a penalty or punishing players, we want to step farther back from than we would at a competitive event, because that will drive players away. Whereas at competitive events, punishment and penalties, they also push players away, but there's not only a higher tolerance for it, but there's an expectation that there is some degree of penalty to some degree for players who make errors. Now, the Master Event document is broken into two sections. You have the event guidelines, which is kind of an extension of the tournament regulations that further explain how events are run, and then the floor rules, which lay out the behavioral expectations and penalty guidelines. So, there are a lot of terms that we just cover in the first part of the Master Event document. We have the three types of events: official, unofficial, and unsanctioned. Official events are approved by FFG and run with an event kit. So that includes pretty much anything with promos that came in an event kit. So that includes, I believe, weekly play, which comes with some instructions. Definitely showdowns, definitely pre-releases, planetary qualifiers, and larger events are going to be official events. Unofficial events are run by an approved organizer without an event kit. So if your local game store runs a 1K or a 2K, or if a larger tournament organizer at a convention runs a large tournament or any tournament but without an event kit, that's an unofficial event. And then unsanctioned events are events not being run by an approved organizer or venue. I believe that all organizers need to have a Asmodee Connect account, which allows them to purchase stuff directly from FFG and have that direct relationship. Something like your local bar or like a college club running a draft or something like that is going to be an unsanctioned event because it's not an official organizer supported by FFG. Then we have two tiers of events. We have casual and competitive. Casual events are focused, as I mentioned previously, on the play experience, whereas competitive is focused more on the prizes and finding the best player. At weekly play, at your pre-release, you don't the goal isn't to find the best player, the goal is to have fun playing the game. At a planetary qualifier, at a sector qualifier, at the Galactic Championships, the goal is nominally to identify the best player and award them prizes for their efforts. Event structure breaks down into weekly play, which is find your own opponent, and tournaments, which are scheduled rounds and opponents. A lot of stores, when they're running their weekly play events, run them as tournaments because that's what players are used to coming from other TCGs and from other games, and it makes things a little bit easier, just on a social level, to have somebody put in front of you and somebody to tell you, this is the person that you're playing against, this is what you're going to play best out of 3, and then you'll move on. Here are the restrictions and requirements. Whereas if you just walk into a game store on, say, a Thursday night, and you go to somebody and say, hey, are you here for weekly play? They say yes, and you're like, great, let's play. And they're like, cool, I'm going to break out my pre-con deck, my starter deck, and you're going to break out your Boba deck that won the PQ last weekend, and we're not going to have a good time. Or if you are a quieter or more anxious or shy person, you may find it difficult to approach people and be like, hello, let us play this game. There are a lot of neurodivergent people, a lot of people who are more on the introverted, quiet, nerdy side than the outgoing side in these areas, and so having a structure allows people to make new friends and find opponents without having to put that burden of finding a person and approaching a person and potentially facing rejection if they're like, nah, I'm not interested in playing, or I'm not interested in playing you. Tournaments allow that, and so a lot of weekly play is tournament structure rather than a weekly play structure. But it also means that at weekly play you can find multiplayer games. Somebody can play Twin Suns. A couple people can play their pre-release decks from the previous weekend that they really enjoyed and just want to play with more. Some people can do starter deck duels. You can probably play Pauper or other variant formats. You can do whatever you want at weekly play as long as you're playing Star Wars Unlimited. Whereas in a scheduled tournament, you're playing a specific format and you're playing best 2 out of 3. As always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop them in the chat. I'll get distracted. I'll read them, even if I'm in the middle of a sentence. But so far, it seems like we're moving smoothly along. Alrighty. Event roles. There are leaders. Events are open to all individuals with some exceptions, and there are several key roles with authority. Ooh, I have a couple questions immediately. Tennessee Feet Monk says, policy question, can we expect a new MED other than the October 17th update prior to the S1 PQs that incorporate the cascade clarifications and lesson learned from S0 PQs? The holes are numerous. So, a couple of answers to that question, one of which is a question you didn't ask. Season 1 is starting in next summer. Season 0 is the entire first year from the release of Spark of Rebellion until, I believe, the conclusion of the Galactic Championship. So that's Season 0. The October Planetary Qualifiers I'm calling Wave 1. I don't know if there's a formal designation for them. I think it's Set 2 Planetary Qualifiers. Set 3 and Set 4 Planetary Qualifiers will be the, I believe, December to February, and then April to June waves, and those will all be part of Season 0. With regards to expecting a new master event document, it takes quite a while for that document to be updated. You'll note that people first discovered it somewhere around October 12th to 14th, and the date on it is roughly a month prior. I first saw an iteration of that in late August. It went through several revisions. Then it went through approvals and licensing, and then it was able to be published. And that was roughly a 2-month process. There hasn't been enough time since the release of that document and now for them to incorporate that feedback to turn it into anything that I have seen. And given that it's a 2-month process, even if I got that today, a week after the document became public, it wouldn't be available until the end of December after Set 3 Planetary Qualifiers had already begun. So I think that it's very unlikely that we will have an update before the Set 3 Planetary Qualifiers. McFerguson says, it feels like we're meant to be pretty lenient with penalties for now for anything that aren't straight-up intentional cheating, malicious, disruptive behavior. As a floor judge, should I be escalating to the head judge anytime I decide not to penalize for something that is in the policy, due to the head judge being involved for policy deviations? Deviations should always go through the head judge. This echoing what Tennessee Feet Monk says, yeah, you should always, if you're not going to issue a penalty, you should talk with the head judge. For competitive tier events, issuing penalties and penalty points and warnings is generally what you should be doing. It's important to be empathetic and aware of players who are stepping into a competitive game for the first time and make sure that they understand what that penalty means for them. 9 times out of 10, probably more than that, probably 99 times out of 100, a player who commits an error isn't going to commit so many more that there's ever a problem for them. It's not going to escalate to 10 penalty points. So what I generally say is when I issue a warning to somebody, and we'll cover this, I think, in the next part of this lesson when we talk about taking a call, but if I'm issuing a warning to somebody, I say, hey, this is a warning. It's nothing to worry about unless you make a habit out of this. And usually players are like, okay, this isn't going to be a problem that's going to haunt me for the rest of my days. I think it's very important to stress to players that a warning isn't on a permanent record. It's not going to be a black mark against them. It's not that we think that they're a cheater. It's just, hey, you made a mistake and we're keeping track of it. It's just a little bit of bookkeeping. iLaugh34 says, Med also says get approval from a head judge for any penalty more than a warning penalty too. Yep, absolutely. McFerguson says, the thought process here is that we heard from you not to go straight to a warning penalty on easily fixed misplay that is corrected right away, so I'm just not sure where the line is at. So, if I'm watching a match and I see somebody move a unit to a zone that it's not supposed to go to, if I catch something before a player has a chance to catch it themselves, like if I say, I attack your boba, deal 3 to it, and you tick the die on your boba and tick up 3 damage, and I'm like, doesn't that only have 2 power right now? I'm not going to issue a penalty, like, if I'm interrupting before any player has taken any action, before the player's finished moving the die, because the players haven't had an opportunity to be like, wait a second, no, it's only 2 damage, it's not 3. If play has moved on, at that point, if I'm interrupting or if the players realize, issuing a penalty point or a warning at competitive tier events is very reasonable. At casual tier events, which is what we're primarily talking about today, you're going to subtract 1 penalty point from pretty much any penalty that you're issuing, which means for the vast, vast majority of cases, it's going to be 0 unless it is a consistent issue where a player's constantly forgetting particular triggers or forgetting to like tap resources appropriately or over-tapping. And by tapping, I mean exhausting, obviously. Be quiet, McFerguson. I know you're going to say it, but you don't get to say it. I corrected myself before you could correct me, so I'm okay. But, yes, if the players catch an error, particularly if the opponent catches an error at a competitive tier event, you want to be issuing a penalty. This helps the player who caught the error feel as though justice is being done and reminds the player who committed the error to be careful. If you're catching the error before the players have the opportunity to, or if the player makes the error and immediately calls it on themselves, particularly at casual tier, step back from the penalties. Just Leon says, I feel like we should make it clear that it is not a big problem unless it happens another time, because the first time I got a warning during an event not related to Star Wars Unlimited, I sweated really hard. Absolutely. And even if it does happen again, most of the time it's just because the person is being a little bit clumsy. This is going to sound a little callous, but some of the language that I used to use was silly or savage. And sometimes you make a silly mistake. Sometimes you just miscount the number of resources you have and exhaust the wrong number. Sometimes you just read the number wrong when you're dealing damage and you say the wrong thing, or you read the number correctly and say the wrong thing. Sometimes your brain just stops working, and we really don't want players to feel bad about when their brain stops working. On the other hand, sometimes they're savage and they're doing it on purpose, and figuring out which it is pretty difficult. One of the things that I talk about in this lesson, if you go through the article itself, I believe I linked to both Magic and Flesh and Blood's floor rules, essentially, for casual tier events. The Magic has the judging at regular document. Regular enforcement level is their equivalent of casual tier. I can't remember what the Flesh and Blood document is called, but both of them essentially have this philosophy of, unless the player is cheating or doing something that's a disqualifiable offense, or they're tardy, the penalty is you fix the problem as best you can and tell them to play on, give them a time extension. And I believe from my conversations with the folks at FFG that is similar to the philosophy that they have here. At casual tier events, we want people to be playing games, unless they're cheating, in which case we don't want them playing games. At competitive tier events, it's a little bit different, and that's something that we're going to talk about in more detail when we get to the level 2 lessons in some time. This lesson isn't really directed towards that. So we can talk about that more in the future. Alrighty. So, events are open to all individuals with some exceptions. The exceptions are players suspended by FFG organized play, minors, people who are prohibited by law, individuals deemed ineligible by Fantasy Flight Games, which is separate from a suspended list, and as an additional asterisk, employees of Fantasy Flight Game, Asmodee, and its subsidiaries or affiliates cannot play in competitive tier events. That's just for tournament integrity purposes. They can play in casual tier events, but not in competitive tier ones. These also apply to all roles. So somebody who is suspended by organized play can't run events nor play in them. Minors can't be in leader roles like judges or scorekeepers, etc., etc. Now, there are several different key roles with authority in event. This is a partial listing, these 4 here. There are a couple more that are discussed, but those are like media roles and that sort of thing that you're not going to see at most events. And these cover the primary responsibilities. The event organizer or tournament organizer oversees the entirety of the event. They provide venue, prizes, product, hire the staff, manage other leadership staff, assist with the logistics. They are involved in everything, and they're responsible for filling all leadership roles by default, unless they have hired staff for that role in particular. iLaugh34 says, can the head judge or tournament organizer participate in a draft that they are running at the store? By policy, the answer is no. You should not do that. This is, again, a consideration for bias. My recommendation for sealed and constructed events is if you are a tournament organizer or a judge on staff for that event and you've been hired to work that event, bring a deck with you or crack some packs and make a sealed deck. Just be like, hey, TO, can I have 6 packs as part of my compensation for running your pre-release or something? And then you just play against whoever has the bye, or if a player wins their match early or has a no-show, you can play against that player. Not only is it a concern of bias, but you also have to be available to deal with situations that come up in the event. In Magic, which doesn't have this restriction, there were definitely events where I tried to both play and judge, but I spent half the round every round answering questions or helping with various incidents at other matches, handling scorekeeper, turning over the round, etc., making sure matches were finished, and that meant that my opponent didn't actually play against a real person. I had to concede the match because I was taking so much time away from the match, and my opponent didn't actually get to play Magic or play the game, which is what they came there to do. And by essentially showing up and conceding every round, I introduced an artificial bye to the event, which damages tournament integrity on a small level. Now, it's absolutely possible to run and play in a draft, but it also makes it very difficult to fix any issues that come up. If, for example, you're playing in a draft and judging it, and 2 packs get mixed up and the players are like, hey, we think we can fix this, but we need a judge to look at it, then you're looking at potentially cards that players have drafted, looking at draft packs on the other side of the table when you as a player normally wouldn't have access to that information. And while you can act as though you didn't have that information, you can't really. The information is in your brain, and unless you have the Men in Black little pen that wipes your memory of the last 5 seconds, you're not going to be able to fix that. If somebody is doing this, if they're both playing in the event and judging in the event, talk to them about why it's not a good idea. It's not necessarily something that is malicious. A lot of people do it because an 8-player draft is a better play experience than a 7-player draft. A 6-player draft is infinitely better than a 5-player draft. If an event isn't going to launch because you don't have enough players to play round robin, without somebody from staff stepping in, like, you get to edge cases at the local game store level where events are really small. But unless you have reason to believe in that there is malicious intent, I wouldn't be terribly concerned. Like, if they are making rulings that you feel are skewed, like a judge is going to issue rewinds for one player but not for another, or they are adjusting pairings so that they're playing against players who generally have weaker performances. If they're doing something like that, that is something to be concerned about. But I think probably 9 times out of 10, if not more than that, the people who are playing in events while running them really just want to play the game more, and this is their one opportunity. Like, if they don't play in the events that they're running, they're never going to get to play the game, and they're just excited to play the game. I can understand it putting a bad taste in your mouth, but if they are simply just, like, pairing matches automatically, getting people to play, it depends entirely on the attitude of the folks at the store and the players at the store and the community and culture. What you can do is just be like, hey, it's cool that you're excited to play in these games. Like, having a store owner or, the store staff be excited about a game is actually really good for the game, because it means that they want to run more events, they want more prizing, they're going to reach out to see if they can get cool promos and that sort of thing, right? They're going to continue to stock the game because they care about the game. If they don't care about the game, they aren't going to be as financially invested in it, which is worse for you. But just being like, hey, policy says that you're not allowed to run this. I have some concerns. Be specific about what your concerns are. If you're worried about them fixing matches, just be like, I know I don't have any reason to mistrust you, but do you mind if I just, like, look over your shoulder so I can learn how you pair rounds, just so that I can become a potential judge in the future? And if you just watch them pair rounds and they're not doing anything fishy, like, yes, it's technically not allowed by policy, but if it's rough to tell somebody who's excited about the game that they're not allowed to play in the game ever. As Tennessee Feet Monk says, in Magic, you can judge and play in casual tier events, and I believe it's also true for Flesh and Blood, and I think it's true for a couple other TCGs, and so a lot of people default to that expectation coming from other games. I think it may also be true for other FFG games, but I'm not entirely sure. However, carrying on, Head Judge is the final authority for all questions regarding rules and policies. In addition to the responsibilities of Floor Judge, they're responsible for making final rulings in the case of an appeal, handling investigations, making tournament announcements, and how to determine how to handle unsporting conduct. There's a lot that falls under the purview of the Head Judge, but essentially they are the one running the tournament. If the tournament organizer wants the Head Judge to do something differently, they don't get to tell the Head Judge how to run their event. They can make suggestions and just be like, hey, I'd really prefer if you announce this, or if we ran things this way. But the Head Judge is the person who gets to make those decisions. Now, as a Head Judge, you're allowed to make those decisions once, and after you make that decision, or before you make it even, the tournament organizer or event organizer can say, hey, I'm removing you from your position as Head Judge. That role falls back to me. I'll handle things from here. So if you're going to do something disastrous, the event organizer and tournament organizer can keep you from saying all players whose names start with J get a bye every round. Or on Tuesdays, Separatist cards are free. If they have the trait Separatist, they cost 0 resources. Like, a Head Judge can say that, and if they're just like, that's what my understanding of the comprehensive rules are, their ruling is final for that event. Please don't do that. These are ludicrous things to say or do. And if you do that, the Head Judge is the event organizer is more than able to say, you're no longer working my event. So the event organizer does have veto power, but only through removing the Head Judge from the event. They don't get to say what happens and what doesn't happen. Floor judges, their primary responsibility is watching matches and assisting players and spectators. They should answer questions players have, taking care only to provide rules information and not strategic advice. However, if you believe the question the player asks is not the question they want answered, you can ask for clarification. This is something that we're going to talk a little bit about in our next slide.
Let's take a quick...
Oh god, it's talking at me.
Alex,
No, stop
Avenger.
talking. Stop talking. Please. Great, good. It stopped talking to me. Now, we don't like it when my computer talks to me in my voice. That disturbs me a lot, in case you couldn't tell. It's Separatist Sunday. I don't know what Saturday is. But, anyways. So, judges must not provide strategic advice to players. But players are going to ask questions that can lead to strategic advice. And the line between what you can and can't answer can get a little bit hairy. However, judges can ask clarifying questions to make sure they understand what the player is asking. So, our example here, Alex controls an adventure and says, "Judge, can I play Vanquish even though my opponent doesn't control any units?" I don't know how many of you have taken this lesson or read this lesson, but what would your answer be to that question? If a player has an Avenger in play, their opponent has no units, and they call you over and say, "Judge, can I play Vanquish even though my opponent doesn't control any units?" What would your answer be? Now I'll play the Jeopardy theme music in my head because I certainly can't replicate it. I see a couple of yeses, and I see a "what are you trying to accomplish with that player?" So, an answer like "you can, but you'd have to choose to defeat your own Avenger, and that's probably bad," is providing strategic advice. It's not just a clear-cut rules answer. An answer like "yes" is technically a correct answer, but it's not a great answer here. Because my presumption when the player is asking that question is what they are intending to ask is, can I play Vanquish and not defeat anything? And so they might say, play Vanquish, defeat nothing, your turn. And then you have to step in and issue a penalty because your ruling wasn't clear enough. In this situation, as I said, I'm presuming that the player wants to know if they can play Vanquish and not defeat anything. But that's not the question they asked. However, the question they asked and the question I think they asked are different things. I need clarification before I can answer. I don't want to make an assumption and answer the question I think they're asking, and then have them go do something wrong. Because they may actually be asking, am I able to play Vanquish on my own Avenger? And so, a good question to ask when you're looking for clarification, or if a player asks a question and you think that the answer you give them will cause them to do something that they don't intend to do, just say, hey, what are you trying to do here? What do you want to have happen? What do you think will happen? And then they're like, I want to play Vanquish and not defeat anything. And at that point, you can now answer the question that they're actually asking and say, if there's a unit in play controlled by either player when you play Vanquish, you must defeat it. And they're like, okay, cool, I can't do what I want. One of the important things about this is we're not testing the player's ability to ask a judge questions. We're testing their strategic and tactical ability, and to some degree their understanding of the rules. But players are very much not expected to have the comprehensive rules as well understood as judges do. But we also don't want to provide strategic advice of like, yes, you can play Vanquish and it'll trigger your boss, but you'll have to destroy your boss because that's the only unit you have left. Although that's really weird because why would you trigger your boss if your opponent doesn't have any units? But that's a different question entirely. If you believe that the player is asking one question and you believe that that is not the question that they're intending to ask, you need to make sure that you're asking the question that you're answering the question that they want to ask. Doing otherwise, simply saying yes, or no, or some sort of straightforward answer, and then hovering and waiting for them to make a mistake is going to cause them to not trust judges. If you take this question and they say, Judge, can I do this thing? And you say yes. And they're like, okay, I do this thing. And you're like, hold on. 1, you're getting a penalty. And 2, you can't do the thing that I just told you you could do. They're never going to call a judge again. That's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but I had a friend back playing Magic years and years ago, and she accidentally drew a card, called for a judge, through the resolution of it, card was shuffled away, the issue was fixed, shuffling up, trying to fix the situation, and then the judge gave my friend an instruction that my friend interpreted as draw a card now. And so she drew a card, and the judge was, you're not supposed to draw that card now. I'm going to be issuing another penalty. This is your second one in a row. This is going to be worse for you. And my friend was like, cool, I'm never going to talk to another judge again in my life if I can help it, because I asked for assistance and I got multiple penalties and no empathy. So keeping in mind what the player wants is an important part of handling a call. JFreak says, is this all in competitive events? I feel like in a casual event, in this scenario, I'm going to explain what happens when Vanquish is played. If they want to kill their unit, okay. If they don't, they won't do that. I think it's important that even at casual events, we don't give outside assistance. So immediately jumping to, you'd have to destroy your own unit, which you might not want to do, isn't great. This situation, I think you can, with relative safety, jump to the point and say, when you play Vanquish, you have to defeat a unit, even if it's one you control. That's not too much strategic advice, but there are lots of situations where it's a little bit more complicated than this scenario, and at casual, I would hesitate to explain what you think they want answered before you get clarification on what they're actually asking, because you may inadvertently provide strategic advice. The tendency towards education is good, and I applaud that. Focusing on education, getting players to understand the game at a casual tier is super important. But I think it's also important to not overload players with too much information, and that's one of the other benefits of saying, what do you want to do and what do you think will happen, because that lets you have the information of that they already have, and you can provide what they need in this moment without overloading them. Jeffrey, you say, I wouldn't say you would have to destroy your own unit, you might not want to do. I would say something like you would play Vanquish and would defeat a non-leader unit if able. If they're still confused, they would follow up with, you mean my own Avenger. It's possible that they would follow up, but they might not. Something that I've found is that if a player thinks they know what the answer is, and they ask you, and like, your answer is technically correct, but this player is expecting a yes or no answer, and they hear an answer that sounds more like yes, and so it's possible that they just straight up interpret it as yes. If you respond with a question, that I think generally changes the way that they're thinking, and they're more open to processing new information. Your answer I don't think would be out of line, because you're explaining the whole interaction, but it's also possible that they had a simpler question. They just did want to answer the question that they asked. This is really more of a be aware of what you're saying, and I think that you have the awareness necessary to answer these questions with appropriate judgment. This is one of the places where judge comes into judgment, right? Like, we're called judges because a lot of times we have to execute decisions based on our own judgment. It's going to happen a lot in trying to figure out what a player is asking. Sometimes they're going to use incorrect terms. They're going to call things triggers that are not triggers. They're going to call things replacement effects that are not replacement effects. They're going to say tap and untap like heathens. We have to interpret them and judge what we think they mean sometimes, or ask for clarification. I tend towards asking for clarification even at casual tier, to ensure that the way it plays out is the most clear-cut way and there's no miscommunication. Just Leon says, can you answer a question where the player is vague so the opponent doesn't know what is happening but is showing you the cards, or is that not allowed to the players? If a player is like, hey, I have a card in my hand that I want to ask you a question about but don't want to reveal that information to my opponent, you can absolutely answer that either in a vague way or more effectively just be like, hey, do you want to ask me away from the table so as to preserve your strategic information? That is absolutely something that you're allowed to do and something that I encourage you to do, especially if the player's like, hey, if I do this, and they point to a card in their hand, does that happen? And you're like, my friend, I don't know what this is or that is. That's very vague. Let's step away from the table so we can actually name cards and effects. ILAF34, what I just said to do, the MED says not to do. I agree. However, in talking with the people who write the master event document, we've had a conversation about this, and they have told me that is a thing that you can and should do. It just hasn't made it into the master event document, despite it being an earlier conversation. Yeah, you're entirely right, ILAF34. Like, it is in the policy document as written. Like, absolutely no shame on you for reading the document. But there are some clarifications, and I have a little bit more access than other people because we are affiliate, or not necessarily affiliate, but we're in a business arrangement with FFG, and so I get to talk with the folks who write those policy documents. McFerguson says, your story about your friend reminds me, is there a mitigating circumstance to penalty on something that is self-reported? One of the tournament reports recently mentioned someone who self-reported when they forgot to de-sideboard. How do we encourage honesty in judge calls while still following penalty policy? This is a difficult question to answer. I think that, so right now, policy doesn't have anything built in for this sort of leniency. However, philosophically, when a player calls an infraction on themselves before their opponent could have seen the infraction, and so it's only something they could have noticed, I think it's appropriate to generally, philosophically speaking, not necessarily as policy documents are written, find some leniency there. So if a player realizes that they've drawn a sideboard card in game one, if it's not... if it hasn't been played, if it's not something that's been discarded from their top of their deck, if their opponent hasn't just played a Viper Probe Droid and is about to see that sideboard card, this player hasn't gained any advantage, and they're calling themselves on it before their opponent had a chance to catch it. However, once it becomes public, it's a lot harder to have leniency because it is a public error, and just being like, oh, you made an error, and even though you caught it yourself, the game state has changed. I think that if we're in the window for reversing decisions, which also isn't in either the tournament regulations or master event doc at this point in time, showing some leniency is possible. So if I play, oh gosh, I have forgotten every single card in the game. If I play Vader and tap 6 resources for him, and then pick up the first card of my deck and I'm like, wait a second, before I resolve this trigger, I should have exhausted 7 resources for Vader. I think there's some consideration for leniency there because the player, I think resolving, if they've picked up a card, we're actually past the point where they've gained information, so we're past the point of reversing decisions. But if they play it, they say, okay, go to resolve my, I'm going to resolve the when played trigger, then the ambush trigger, and then they're like, wait a second, I've only exhausted 6 resources for this, I need to exhaust the 7th. At that point, I'm not going to issue a penalty because their opponent hasn't done anything, their opponent couldn't have done anything, they haven't gained any information. We're still in the place where they could be like, that actually isn't the play that I intended to do. If we've moved past that point, even if the player catches it themselves, it has been public information, their opponent may have made decisions based on it, and it's important to track penalties. Again, this is at competitive events, at casual tier events, there's always going to be a little bit more leniency. If a player comes up to you in like round 1 and they're like, hey, I think I submitted my deck list and I think I have an error in it, there's a possibility for some leniency there, but there's also some possibility for advantage where they've changed their deck after playing round 1 and they're like, oh wow, everybody around me is playing Sabine, I need to have a stronger main deck against Sabine, let me just swap a couple cards around to get that advantage, and then I'll just confess that I have a deck list error. That's a lot harder to do. Um, I Laugh 34. Don't apologize for interrupting. Please do. Tennessee Feet Monk says Jonah slides are like 10 minutes without interruptions. He needs interruptions to fill the 1.5 hour stream. Absolutely. I mean, we're on like slide 4 of 10 of presentation 1, so we're going to be here all night. Anyways, we've finished answering calls, a tangent. J-Freak, for the decklist context, does it matter what the mistake was? I think I would have to have an explicit example in front of me. If a player, like, left off their base, and, like, they were just like, yeah, I'm playing Boba, and then they register a list that's all cunning units, and like, hey, Judge, I forgot to register my base. I would probably consider some leniency there, because to me, I don't even know the name of the rare cunning base from Spark of Rebellion or Resistance. Like, I don't know that card because it sees absolutely no play, and they're very clearly not playing any other off-color base. Sure, Jeddah City sounds reasonable. What's it do? Does anybody know that without looking it up? Probably. You, like, exhaust a thing? Anyways, if they were, like, playing Boba Green, and they're like, hey, Judge, I forgot to register my base, I'd have a lot more questions because the difference between any generic green base and ECL is significant, and both of those decks do see play. J-Freak says, I forgot that I swapped top target and had resupplies instead. I think that's hard decision to make. I would probably be issuing, at the very least, a warning for this, because there is some advantage to be gained if it's, like, after you've been able to play the game and see what people are playing. Being able to edit your deck list is an incredibly powerful tool, and we don't want to allow people to do that. There'd have to be some evidence of this being the deck that you wanted to play. Like, if you had sent an email to your friend, like, if you'd had a conversation with your friends, like, through text, being like, I'm gonna swap resupplies for top target, or something like that. Do any of you have spare copies? And somebody's like, yeah, I got some, here you are. Here's a picture of me providing you the resupplies because we need to keep track of the commons that we're lending around. At that point, I'd consider some degree of leniency, but it's very much a case-by-case basis. And I would generally not deviate away for leniency on deck list problems, because, again, being able to edit your deck list in the middle of a tournament, even if it's towards the beginning, it's a very, very powerful tool. So I think the vast majority of the times, unless there were extenuating circumstances, something significant and exceptional, to borrow a phrase from another game that shall not be named, I would probably not be lenient in that case, even if the player brought attention to themselves, because I have no way of knowing what their deck originally was or what they were supposed to be playing. It may not be a mistake, and it's hard to investigate that. If somebody, like, registers, like, Avenger copies 4 through 6, and they're like, hey, Judge, I think I wrote Avenger on my deck list twice, that's an easier one to be like, oh yeah, we'll deal with that, because while the deck list is illegal, if they play Avenger number 4, their opponent is sure as all heck gonna call a Judge. Anyways, ending the tangent, 20 minutes later. So, going back to the event roles and leaders, the last role to talk about is Scorekeeper. Scorekeepers are experts in tournament software and are able to manage the event smoothly and handle potential disruptions or errors. For most events at the local store level, job is going to be handled by a judge or member of the store staff, and Thursday's lesson is going to be an intro to Melee, so that you'll have a good idea of what you need to do to create and run an event. Tower number 9 says, I was once in an event where someone switched to a different deck between rounds and didn't know it wasn't allowed. What would be appropriate in that case? I think the judge ended up giving him a match loss and making him go back to the first deck for future rounds. So, at a casual tier event, I think that, like, particularly for a weekly play, I would just say, hey, this isn't allowed. Please fix your deck. Um, I don't know if I would have a conversation with the player and be like, hey, why did you switch decks? And if they're like, I'm new to the game and I wasn't having fun playing Sabine because everybody was playing Boba and I just kept on dying and I wanted to have fun, I'd be like, okay, you're not allowed to switch decks. I know that, like, you're just getting crushed by Boba. So please switch back to Sabine. You're not allowed to switch. Just play on from here. If they're like, oh, well, I knew my opponent was going to be on, like, I saw the pairings. I saw my opponent was on Boba, so I wanted to switch so that I could beat them. Or I changed my deck because I knew that I had a better matchup against this person. That's much more concerning. But it's, again, if the player doesn't know that they've done something wrong, it's certainly not cheating. You have to know that you're doing something wrong for it to be cheating. And by policy, deck problems are generally game losses, if they are significant. I can see issuing a game loss here, but at casual tier, unless it had an outsized impact on the event, I might not do anything, frankly. A player who's making this mistake almost certainly is an unengaged player. Somebody who is at their first event or one of their first few events and doesn't understand tournament structure. And issuing them a penalty for simply not knowing the rules that nobody ever told them is a real big feel bad. Like, I don't even know if the tournament regulations stipulate that you have to play the same deck every round. If somebody can find in documentation if it says you have to play the same deck every round at non-competitive tier events, because competitive tier events you have the deck list, but at casual tier events, does it say you have to play the same deck every round? If somebody can find that for me, that'd be great. I don't have the time to go looking that up. But it's possible that, like, somebody shows up to an event, they're told, yeah, just play a deck, whatever deck you want to play, have fun. Like, if they're switching between the Luke and Vader starters, they're doing this because they want to play the game, and penalizing them harshly is going to make them feel real bad. Tennessee Pete Monk says that competitive sticking to policy protects you as a judge. You can be sympathetic, but deviating because you don't want to hurt feelings is not educating a player well, and it's not fair to those who are educated about policy and events and get the normal penalty. Absolutely, yeah. And if they're upset at you, you can say, this is what policy says, this isn't a significant circumstance, this is what I'm supposed to do. It's also important to remember that the opponent is a player too in a match of two players, and being kind to one player can sometimes be doing a disservice to the other player in that match. Just Leon, if they know what matchup is good or bad, but doesn't know that you can't change deck between rounds. Yeah, so if they're like, if somebody's like, I'm switching because I know the matchup is bad, that raises some alarm bells. If somebody's like, I built this deck because I was having fun with it playing with my friends at home, but then I came here and I just lost a lot and I didn't have any fun, and so I switched to a deck that I thought I would have more fun with, and they're just like, I was here for the fun and I wasn't having fun, I'm going to be a little bit less concerned. ILAF34 with pre-release and draft, technically no. If you're referring to switching your decks, in fact, you're explicitly allowed to switch decks between games and rounds at pre-release and draft. Or as much as your pool allows you to. But, moving on. Player roles. Players are expected to be at their matches, have the supplies required to play the game, abide by rules and regulations, and respect other participants. Spectators can be in-person, digital, and official media coverage, or random people like present at the event, whether they be spectators who wandered in looking for a flea market where you have your card game tournament. That's a thing that's happened to me. It could be folks from the convention next door, whether that be an international food convention, a battle of the bands, a neuroscience convention. They're like, oh, we're nerds, you're nerds, let's see if we have anything in common. A lot of people will come into large events. A lot of people walk into a local game store during an event, and they're expected to follow the rules of spectators, even though they might not necessarily know the game. This means that they must not provide outside assistance, must not disturb games, and must be respectful of staff, players, and other spectators. The must not disturb games thing is a little bit strangely worded, to the point that if you, as a spectator, see an error, you should absolutely not tell the players what the error is, because you may be mistaken. However, I believe it's appropriate, and from my understanding from conversation with folks at FFG, it's appropriate to say, I think I see an error, I'm going to call a judge, and then just raise your hand and call for a judge. Frequently, when you don't have the authority to tell players stop playing, they get to continue their match until a judge asks them, or another tournament official asks them to stop playing. But often, if a spectator calls for a judge, players are like, oh, something may have gone wrong in our game. Let's take a look. And by them pausing the game, if something in fact has gone wrong, less time or fewer actions will elapse between the error occurring and you arriving, and so it's much, much easier for the problem to be fixed. I've had calls where spectator calls for a judge, I get there, and I'm able to fix what would have been a very complicated scenario if things had moved forward at all. On the other hand, I've had calls where somebody thought they saw something go wrong, comes find me, and then walks over to me, and by the time we get to the event, or to the match, the game was over, and so I couldn't even observe and determine if there was an error, much less fix it. Zeph Mag says, I would like to be set up next to an international food convention at my next event, please. It was fantastic. I went there for lunch every day, and I had something new. It was right next door, and it was cheap, and it was fantastic. McFerguson says, Premier versus Limited formats definitely have different rules, yeah. Tower number 9 says, yeah, awkwardly, the event where this happened was in between casual and competitive. It was a win-a-case event, if I recall correctly, and the store wanted it to be stricter than a normal weekly event, but at the same time, it wasn't an official competitive tier event. So, for your store's knowledge, you can run any type of event at competitive tier and use full competitive policy, even if it isn't an official event. It's just that a certain subsection of official events are definitionally competitive events. Planetary qualifiers, sector qualifiers, regional qualifiers, and the Galactic Championship are always competitive events. Pre-releases and weekly play are always casual tier. Showdowns are recommended to be run at casual tier. But if you run an event at your store, if it has a large prize pool, you can absolutely choose to run it at competitive. It's simply not an official event. It'll be an unofficial competitive tier event. I'll have to double check the master event document saying unofficial events are always casual tier. I believe you. But you can certainly run interesting. Yeah, no. That's interesting. That's something that I want to talk with FFG about. I think it's something that they have changed their policy or their philosophy on, because they recognize that there will be other events that will be large and will have significant prize pools and should be run at competitive, should have deck lists, etc., etc. iLaugh34 says, I'm loving the tiny details, but how can we as judges or spectators be expected to know these tiny details only said during the live stream? Like MED says, spectators can't interrupt games, and you just said someone can technically say they see something without disturbing or interrupting. So that's one of the things that we're working on here. We're trying to include these informations in the lessons. We're trying to include them in the broadcasts. We're trying to include them in the policy clarifications document when we get them. Part of what we're doing here is a pyramid scheme of delivering information. I get information, I give it to judges give it to the players and spectators at their event. It's unfortunate that there is so much turnaround time on updating the policy documents and getting the language clarified so that it is in an official document. However, this is part of the purpose of Cascade Games, one of the things that we have been explicitly asked to do, is act as a faster funnel for these clarifications. However, players and spectators will never know everything. Most of them have not read the master event document, the tournament regulations. Most of them haven't read the comprehensive rules, or probably even the quick start rules. I think most players have just been taught by their friends and go ahead and play. The thing is, as long as, like, it is part of our job at Cascade, and it's part of the responsibility as judges to help educate the community. If somebody isn't doing something wrong, but they are doing something misguided, provide them education. If they are doing something wrong, provide them education and ask them to stop. However, like, these expectations aren't something that you're going to penalize somebody for if they make a misstep without understanding. Reading Twitch chat real quick. Tennessee Feet Monk says, a huge disheartening thing is that there are 2,000 plus judges in the Discord, but only around 15 of them speak and reference things. Really need judges to be involved. It's more than 15, but it is certainly not a huge percentage. However, to me, that's not disheartening. As somebody who's on the quieter side, if I wasn't in charge of the Discord, I probably wouldn't talk in there. It's really hard to put yourself in front of 2,500 people and say, this is what the rules say, this is what the policy says. Having that sort of confidence doesn't come naturally to everybody, and being there and listening, I think, is a great first step. So for the lurkers out there, thank you for lurking. I really appreciate you. And I hope that one day you do feel comfortable and confident enough in your knowledge to express it. And the best way to develop that confidence is by offering answers. Even if you're wrong, the folks in the community who are most vocal, I think, in my experience, have generally been very kind and gentle in correcting folks. In the live rules and live policy conversations, they can be a little bit more brusque because it's a live call and they want to make sure that the correct information gets to the judge who's on site immediately. But if you have a question about rules, the discussion threads, the general chat, those are all great places to dip your toes into the water and get a little bit more experience. Anyways, okay, holy crap. We're an hour in and we haven't even hit the floor rules. So, oh boy, we're gonna rush because I was supposed to get to dinner soon, TM. Anyways, floor rules, philosophy, and guidelines. Again, keep in mind that this is talking about casual tier events primarily, and so this is going to be a little bit different than how we would run things at competitive. I'm going to try and keep myself from going on tangents about competitive because I'm now aware of the clock. So, it's important for the game and organized play for everyone to play fairly. If a game develops a reputation as a game where cheaters exist and persist, the game loses organized play, and without organized play, stores don't have a draw to get players into them, and so they stop stocking the product and the game goes away. So making sure that games are fair is hugely important. However, at casual tier events, gameplay errors and disruptions should be handled with a gentler touch. It's important to remain empathetic. Most of these players, this is their first step into organized play. For newer players, particularly at pre-release weekends, you want to be kind to the players and focus on education. Issuing a game loss at casual events should practically never happen. I've been judging for a decade. I've judged I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of events. I don't believe, ever seen a game loss issued at a casual tier event outside of an issue regarding tardiness. Those lines are pretty straightforward. If a player's not at their event or not at their match, they're causing a pretty significant disruption. Everything else is fixable to some degree. Even if the game isn't perfectly fair, you can get it as close to on track as possible and play on from there. Alright, gameplay disruptions. Making an error intentionally is cheating. Both players have a responsibility for the game state, and there are 3 potential remedies. This is another one of those deviations from the master event document that we'll get to. There are 2 active remedies and 1 passive remedy, and we'll talk about that in a second. we don't talk about it a lot in the lesson, and I'm not going to talk about it a huge amount here, but both players do have a responsibility for the game state. If you see your opponent make an error, it is your responsibility to point it out. Seeing your opponent make an error and knowing that they made an error and not calling attention to it, if you're aware of this, is cheating. It's very hard to investigate for that, but if you notice that your opponent puts too much damage on their base or on a unit, or misses a mandatory effect, or does something wrong, if they don't draw enough cards from an effect, it is your responsibility to make sure that your opponent is playing the game correctly. This game is designed that all cards do what they say they do, following the comprehensive rules, and somebody forgetting or having a lapse of judgment and just their synapse is not firing, that's not what we're testing. We're testing your ability to play the cards as they're designed and written against other cards. We're not testing your memory here. Now, the remedies. We have Resolve Now, which is we take the overlooked rule or ability and apply it immediately without giving either player significant advantage that they would not have had were the ability resolved correctly. The example that I use here, a player forgets to put an experience counter on a unit due to the resolution of Gideon Hask's when an enemy unit is defeated triggered ability. It's discovered in the regroup phase. You can safely resolve that issue now, as neither player would receive a significant advantage, and the player who committed the error might receive minor disadvantage because they didn't have that experience token. It shouldn't be a counter, it's a token. Anyways, if you fix it, then like the worst thing that happens is the player who made the mistake has a minor disadvantage. Now, if you discover that same issue as Gideon Hask is being attacked by a 5-power unit, which would kill Gideon Hask, resolving the ability now could turn a lethal attack into a one-sided combat where Gideon Hask survives and the attacking unit dies, rather than the other way around, potentially. Resolving now for that situation gives one player a huge advantage, and particularly it gives a huge advantage to the player who made the error. In that case, rewinding to the point of error should be considered. That other fix, rewinding, says to undo all actions up to the point of error, and then move forward in time, resolving the effect correctly. To be a bit metaphorical, this creates a new timeline, and so if cards have been played since the point of error, we undo the playing of those cards. Those cards go back into the player's hand, and they're not required to play those cards again. This does mean that the game can play out very differently than it did when the error, than in the timeline where the error had occurred, and players do have information that they would not necessarily have had, and they're allowed to use that information. However, that can be disruptive, and so that's something to take into consideration. JFreak says, do you think getting penalized for your opponent's gameplay errors sticks around? It's different in other games. Oh, no. So, yeah. Right now, I don't believe it explicitly gives you penalty points. I think that failing to catch your opponent's errors should generally be a non-upgrading penalty, so 0 penalty points, but we track it, and then in round 4, I'm just like, hey, you have missed 17 of your opponent's mandatory effects. Can you explain to me why you keep on letting your opponents make mistakes when I've told you you're not allowed to let your opponents make mistakes? Are you just that oblivious? Because you're going to have some talking to do. I think it's important to track. I think it is also important to not penalize. Notably, if you... what is it? These penalties should only be issued if you don't catch it immediately. So, like, if your opponent misses their Gideon Hask trigger, or puts a unit into play ready, and you're like, hey, you're not allowed to do that before anything else happens, you shouldn't be penalized for that because you caught it as soon as you could. What do you mean by open up opportunities to angle shoot? Is it one player makes an error on purpose so that their opponent doesn't catch it? Or what? I know this is a bit of a tangent, but I think it's important to address. I'm going to keep on talking while you answer that so that we don't get too far behind schedule like we already are. Anyways, the last situation is leaving as is. Sometimes you can't make the game better, and while it's unfortunate, it's true. One player will have an advantage, but that's okay to a degree if the advantage gained is less impactful than the unnatural advantage gained if the game were to be rewound or the ability resolved now. So going back to both players being responsible for the game state, I think that there are some situations where both players should receive penalty points. If I have a regional governor naming a card and you play that card, you've played a card that you're not allowed to play, but I control the game rule that has changed that, and so I am more responsible than I am normally for game rules in the CR. Or like if I have Kira naming Darth Vader and you pay 7 for Vader instead of 10, I'm more responsible for you underpaying that than I normally am if you were to play Vader for 6. Tennessee Feet Monk says, right now I can put my Waylaid unit into discard on purpose and get my opponent a penalty point when I realize it later, so it can be gamed both ways. You would also, 1, get a penalty point for making the error, and 2, there'd be potentially some investigation, although generally the discard pile is less accessible than the hand, so I'd have some questions for you. But yeah, making sure that it is harder to get your opponent, like, I don't want players to be able to commit their first error, potentially on purpose, and then have their opponent not notice it and get them their 10th error and have it upgrade. There needs to be some consideration on how it's mirrored. And it's complicated because you want to incentivize players calling judges, but you also want to penalize players who don't realize stuff on time. But let's move on. Gameplay disruptions, we were very brief. This is when we talked about, well, the document says drawing extra cards. That's what the lesson says. I should change that. The audio is also going to say drawing extra cards. It was changed to card manipulation errors the day after I published this lesson. This is a little bit of a complex subject, but if cards go into a hidden zone, whether it be the hand, resource, or deck, if the cards can be unambiguously identified, use those cards for the fix. So if I start drawing for my regroup and I pick up 3 cards, and those cards haven't touched the other cards in my hand, they can be unambiguously identified. If I have my hand splayed out on the playmat, and then I shuffle my deck after resolving a search and put it straight down, and I put a nice square deck on top of my splayed out hand, the cards in my hand can probably be unambiguously identified. In the situation where you can unambiguously identify the cards that accidentally entered another zone, simply take those cards and return them to the appropriate zone. If the zone is a random zone, like the deck, they're shuffled into the random portion. That means if you've completed any search effects and you know the bottom 9 cards due to a Vader resolution, you go ahead and leave those 9 cards and shuffle the rest. If you don't know exactly what those cards are or exactly how many, because you can't remember what exactly has resolved and how many cards you've found from all of the effects that have caused you to search, get as much information as you can from the players and give it your best guess. Most times this won't be relevant, and you'll be off by 1 or 2, and it's very minor, and you just do your best. If the cards can't be unambiguously identified, for example, you drop cards from your hand into your resource pile and your resource pile's all muddled up, or if you accidentally draw 3 cards for your regroup phase and the 3 cards enter your physical hand, the way it works is you reveal the set of hidden cards. So if you draw extra cards into your hand, you would reveal your hand. Your opponent chooses which cards belong in your hand and which excess cards, so in this case 1 extra card, goes back to the zone it should belong to. This mitigates any potential for advantage. Using a random fix means that if I desperately need 1 card to win and I draw 3 cards, I've gotten an extra draw towards that, even if I have a 1 in 3 chance of it being shuffled back if my opponent catches me, or even if I call it on myself. Whereas if I reveal it to my opponent and they get the choice, this mitigates any potential for advantage because they're going to say, oh, that's the best card at this moment in time. Similarly, I know that there is now instruction in the master event document that if you put your hand on the playmat to put a counter or some other indicator on top of your hand to indicate that it's your hand. But if cards between a player's hand and resources somehow get muddled, or like you put down your hand of 4 cards and you have 4 resources and you pick up your 4 resources and say, Judge, these are my resources I picked up, that's my hand. And the opponent isn't able to unambiguously say, I agree that those are the resources, they may have gotten mixed up, I can't be certain. The opponent is the one who makes the decision, and they're going to make the decision that's worst for the player who makes the error. However, because we're dealing with a lot of hidden information, this is something that's very, very difficult to fix in any other way. Again, as mentioned, random doesn't fix this fully, and we can't rewind it other than random. So this is better than a game loss and better than leaving as is, because that opens up huge windows for opportunity to gain advantage. Of course, be very, very careful with this fix as it reveals hidden information. When you're issuing one of these things, and we're going to talk about in the next lesson of how to handle a judge call, which is one of the longest lessons anyways, make sure you talk to the players about what you're going to do. Tell them that they're not going to do anything until you've expressed the ruling. And then make sure they understand what's going to happen, then execute that. Moving on. Alright. Event disruptions. There's a bunch of stuff happening under event disruptions. We have tardiness, a game loss after 5 minutes, and a match loss and drop after 10 minutes. These are just pretty straightforward hard lines. If a player's not at an event or at their match, we can't expect their opponent to sit there for the entirety. If somebody does show up between 0 and 9 minutes, just issue them a time extension and have them play their full match, or after 5 minutes with a game loss. If a player is dropped from an event, they can rejoin later with a match loss for every round they were absent for. At casual tier with a deck problem, fix the deck as best you can. It can be difficult if a player has like 4 copies of a card and now they're playing 49 cards and they have to add an additional card. At casual tier, adding a card from their sideboard or another card, yes, there's some advantage to be gained here, but we're focusing on education. At competitive tier, we have deck lists, and it's a little bit different. Mark cards, you're going to want to replace sleeves, find replacement cards, or issue proxies as necessary. Slow play, particularly at casual tier, prompt players to make decisions or increase their pace of play rather than issuing warnings. You may have to be pretty consistent and steady with your prompt and just be like, hey, I need you to make a play, I need you to keep an eye on your pace of play. But players who play slowly will over time very frequently find themselves in the draw bracket and have fewer, they'll just keep on losing and it won't be a great experience for them. They'll learn over time, ideally, that they need to pick up their pace of play. You shouldn't be prompting them constantly, but you may need to prompt players more than a couple times. For hygiene, utilize your store standards. The expectations for hygiene vary depending on store and local community and culture. So just keep that in mind when managing hygiene. You want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable at an event, and you don't want to make somebody feel uncomfortable due to their physiology. Some people are naturally, for example, sweatier, and while you may ask that they are aware of their body odor and make sure that they maintain themselves to make sure that everybody's comfortable at the event, you don't want to embarrass them. So these conversations are best generally had off to the side rather than in front of somebody else if you need to have those conversations. Finally, we're going to get to unsporting conduct. Unsporting conduct is enforced as strictly at casual as it is at competitive. Everything else we've talked about, I've been like, hey, relax a little bit, it's casual, we're supposed to have fun, we're all here to have a good time. At all of this behavior is entirely not tolerable. Harassment, aggressive behavior, bribery and collusion, vandalism and theft, stalling and cheating, 0 tolerance. Inappropriate behavior, so excessively being loud and disruptive, occasional foul language, that sort of attitude, something that some people might call locker room behavior. Being like, hey, that isn't appropriate, cut it out now, is often enough for players to realize that their language or behavior is over the line and bring it back in, as long as it is not over the line of harassment. Harassment is generally targeted towards somebody or a class of people. So that's any sort of slurs or like directed towards an individual. Harassment can also be non-malicious in nature. Somebody could just, like, if somebody opens a really cool card and somebody else wants it, they could potentially bug somebody to the point where it becomes harassment. It probably would be inappropriate behavior to start and should be handled with a stern discussion. Similarly, sometimes if somebody, for example, is being asked out or treated differently because of how they present, that can sometimes be inappropriate behavior. If somebody's like, oh, did your boyfriend teach you? That sort of thing. That's very close to being the line of harassment almost immediately, but just a stern, hey, this is not appropriate, do not repeat it, generally will handle it. But if it's repeated, it quickly becomes harassment. Aggressive behavior is essentially any physical action towards somebody or threat of physical action towards somebody. Bribery and collusion, we've talked about a little bit before, but that's resolving a match without actually playing a game of Star Wars Unlimited or intentionally conceding to your opponent. The lines of collusion are pretty complex because people want to be able to not double draw and both get 0 match points, and so people try to dance around that line, but asking for a concession is not allowed. Saying, hey, a concession, like a draw here is bad for both of us and I have a better chance in top 8 or I have a better chance to make top 8, that's under collusion. You're discussing the outcome of the match explicitly. You are allowed to discuss the game state and be like, hey, I have an adventure in play and 5 other units. You're at 2 health on your base. You have no cards in hand and no units in play. You can say that. You're allowed to analyze the game as long as the game is ongoing. Bribery, you can't offer prizes or anything to somebody. Blackmail and coercion, also not allowed, even though they're not necessarily called out, but they can be considered forms of bribery. Vandalism and theft, damaging anybody's property or threatening to do so, taking somebody's property or threatening to do so, absolutely not allowed, 0 tolerance. These 4, harassment, aggressive behavior, bribery, collusion, vandalism, and theft, don't have cutouts for players not knowing that they're not allowed to do them. It's assumed that by participating in society, you know that you're not allowed to hurt, harass, or steal. Whereas stalling and cheating, you have to be aware that what you're doing is not allowed. Stalling is intentionally slow playing to take advantage of a clock. Playing at a normal pace to take advantage of a clock, however, is okay. You don't have to play explicitly faster than normal. If time on the clock is running down, you can continue to play at a moderate pace as long as it is not slow play, and you can do so intentionally to run down the clock as long as it's not slow play. However, slow play is subjective and it's very hard, and so if you do that, you might get into some hot water with regards to stalling. Cheating, you have to do something wrong, gain an advantage, and know you did something wrong. If you don't know you did something wrong, it's not cheating, it's simply an error. Similarly, if you're not gaining an advantage, it's not really cheating. There's some weird questions about like what you're like doing something wrong and knowing you're doing something wrong. What are you doing that's not gaining you advantage and why are you doing that? And to some degree, there's some arguments about social value being an advantage, but like, yeah, don't let people cheat in your events. That should be straightforward enough. Alrighty. That should be enough of that lesson. Fantastic. Great. Now, we're going to cut over to the next lesson. Oh boy, it's 6:20. Wonderful. Alright, we're not going to save those changes. We're going to start this slideshow and keep on moving. If any folks have any questions, please feel free to hit me, as always, as I get this next presentation going. We're going to be just jumping right into taking a judge call. This one, like with the master event document, is just a lot of me talking at you. So, I'm not seeing any questions, but that's probably because I'm talking a mile a minute, and we're just going to dive right into our next lesson. And we're going to just cut back to that. Hey, look, technology. Fantastic. So, taking a judge call. Answering judge calls is the most important part of judging. It's what we do. Yeah, there's logistics and there's investigations and there's supporting the community and growing the community, educating other judges, there's understanding policy, having conversations, giving feedback to tournament organizers and to publishers about the game and policy and all that sort of thing. But answering calls is what a judge is. When you close your eyes and imagine a card game judge, you imagine somebody coming over to your match and fixing a problem. You imagine the person, like, some of you might imagine people carrying around pairings or making announcements, but really, the thing that players think of when they think of a judge is answering calls. And it's where we get 90-95% of our direct interactions with players. It's how players will see us the vast majority of the time, and it's how we're generally evaluated. So much of our training is focused on how to answer calls on a mechanical level. We've just spent 14 lessons covering the comprehensive rules so you can answer rules questions correctly, and a couple of those lessons were on tournament regulations and master event document so that you know how to fix things correctly when a call comes up. So far we've had, every lesson so far has been about answering calls, just not explicitly. Now, for how you actually handle a call, there are no explicit rules other than you should be, being polite and respectful. That stuff is, I don't know if I would call it an explicit rule. There are guidelines. There are different ways to doing it. I have a relatively relaxed professional style. At least that's how I feel about it. And your personal judging style will evolve over time. Some folks are much more linear in the way that they deliver rulings, whereas other folks are a little bit more freeform and a little bit more laid back and relaxed. And your personal style will evolve over time. So, every judge call starts out the same way, by, ideally, a player raising their hand in the air so it's visible and shouting for a judge. I recommend having them call for a judge rather than calling you by your name, even at your local store, because if you're not there and another judge is, that judge isn't going to answer to your name unless you have the same name. Similarly, it reduces concerns regarding bias because you are treated equally by everybody, and a player doesn't have to know you personally in order to call you. They can just call judge, and an anonymous judge will show up and help them. It also helps with triage at a local store or at a larger event where some players have begun to recognize me. If they come up to me and say, "Hey, Jonah, I want to talk to you about this," that's different than a judge call where somebody says judge. Sometimes if you're in the middle of a call, you make the call or the decision that the conversation you're having right now is more important than an unknown judge call, because you may be having a conversation about a previous call. You might be having a conversation about a player's concern about cheating, that sort of thing. But generally, judge is going to take priority over a personal appeal to you being like, "Hey, Jonah, can I talk to you about this thing?" You're going to find the players, and then you're going to indicate your awareness to the players as soon as you can. Players and people in general respond to how quickly they're acknowledged, not how quickly they're helped. And so this is something that was tested or discovered in customer service call lines, where if you have somebody pick up the phone immediately and say, "Hey, thank you for calling us, we're a bit busy right now," an actual human acknowledges you, and they're like, "Right now the wait time is so long, but we'll be able to handle you in just a little bit." That feels so much better, and having that acknowledgement from a human being, not from a robot, in 5 seconds saying it's going to be 20 minutes feels better to people than having to wait 5 minutes with no information. And so I generally raise my hand too, and as soon as I can lock eyes with the player, I wave slowly, and then as soon as the player sees me waving, I point generally at them. I use the Disney point, using the whole open palm rather than finger guns or anything more aggressive, just the whole palm pointed at them. So it's just a continuation of the wave, and then they recognize that signal as I am coming to you exactly. Sometimes another judge will be closer to them, but they've locked eyes with me, and I wave them to say, "No, look the other way." They look the other way, they see the judge coming. But that sort of indication that you're aware of them is really helpful for the players. You can also use this time as you approach to check the clock, because you're going to want to issue a time extension. Another thing that raising the hand does, lets other judges know that you are moving towards that. I also, as I get close, reach out verbally. This is usually when I'm like, I don't know, 5 or 10 feet away, just a couple of meters away, where I'm in raised voice but not shouting range, particularly over the hubbub of a larger convention hall, because it lets me get the conversation started and brings both players' attention to me sooner, especially if one of them don't notice it. Or if neither of them have noticed it, my voice is, they're listening for something, they're trying to hear something, and me saying howdy folks or hey folks gets them to pay attention to me. JFreak7 says, I do a finger on my nose, quick spin, double finger shoot, they usually get it, I'm on the way. I love that. I don't have the, whatchamacallit, not the dexterity or agility, the ability, I can't do that, the coordination, that's the word I'm looking for, it's a keyword in the next set. Anyways, so when you get to the call, you evaluate the atmosphere. There are different categories of calls, and you're going to want to handle each of them differently. Sometimes they're empirical calls. It's, hey, judge, how does this card work? Or what is this interaction? Or what is the text of this? What is the cost of that? How much time is left in the round? These are all answered by facts, and these are relatively straightforward to deal with. Cooperative calls, the players are working together to resolve an issue. It's something like, hey, judge, we just realized that I've been tracking my base damage on my life pad as well as on my base. I realize that I have my base at 22 damage marked on it. My opponent, who's also tracking damage, has me at 23, and we're not sure what happened. Can you please help us out? We're trying to figure out where that damage is coming from. Cooperative, the players agree on most things. They just don't know what the solution is, and they're looking for help together. Contentious, players disagree and are not working together. This could be the same exact call, a life total discrepancy, where it's like, hey, I'm confident that I'm at 22 and my opponent's confident that I'm at 23 damage on my base. We disagree vehemently. I'm correct, my opponent is incorrect. And they disagree on reality. Combative is they disagree and are displaying hostility. So it's, I know I'm at 22, my opponent wrote down 23 and they're cheating, I would like you to disqualify them. That's not quite a call I've had, but I have had a player tell me to my face and to their opponent's face, judge, my opponent is cheating and I would like you to disqualify them. And that was a combative situation, and you handle that very differently than a player being like, hey judge, how much time is left in the round? So it was a USC minor, but also their opponent was cheating, so like it was a weird one to balance, because I was like, okay, so thank you for letting me know your opponent was cheating. Please talk to me away from the table, say, hey, judge, my opponent's cheating, can you investigate? And then I come back to the match, and then I disqualify your opponent. But one of the things that you can do at a call is use your body language. It's very powerful here. Something that some judges do is they remain standing at the call, and they stay straight vertical, and with players sitting, that gives them a couple feet of height, which puts them in position of authority and power, which can in fact be intimidating to players and make them not as cooperative with you. If you can, lowering yourself to the player's height, either by squatting or if your knees have started to give out, grabbing a chair next to the match helps a lot. Sometimes you can lean over, however that can still lead to a looming presence that isn't as ideal as squatting or sitting in a nearby table. If the players are a little bit combative or contentious, you can also lean into the middle of the match and just kind of physically block the players from looking at each other and have your body in the middle so they have to pay attention to you. For some of these longer calls, use introductions, particularly combative and contentious ones, where you're going to have to be asking questions of both players, and some of the questions may sound accusatory, saying Josh, James, Meg, Rachel, using their names and then asking the question feels a lot more personal than being like, you, explain to me why you made this error. Saying, Rachel, why did you put this extra card into play? Or what happened that caused you to exhaust 6 resources? Mike, when did you realize that Rachel hadn't exhausted the appropriate number of resources? Not only does it make the person feel better about themselves, but it humanizes the opponent and can help calm things down a little bit in a more competitive or combative call. You also can change your demeanor over the course of the call. I've definitely had calls where I come in, I sit down, I start answering the call, the players start to get a little bit combative, and rather than leaning in and forward, I straighten up and close off my body language a little bit, and I direct their attention more towards me and tell them that they need to be quiet, and we're doing things my way, and it's not a democracy. Judge calls are a little bit more dictatorial because we're in charge. Tennessee Feet Monk says, in contentious and combative calls, players like to talk over each other. I like to let them take turns telling me what happens and letting each know that they will get a turn to tell their full side of the story. Absolutely. One of the first things I do, particularly with contentious calls, is I say, hey folks, I know that we both have our different sides of the story. I want to hear it from you first, and then afterwards you can tell me either the whole story or just make corrections. I just don't want any interruptions right now. I want to hear one full story, then the other. Letting them know that they're going to be heard. Again, it goes back to the let people know that they are being attended to sooner rather than later, even if you know you're going to do it. So, you're going to want to understand the question. As quickly as possible, you're going to figure out what the players need to know. Sometimes it's you showing up to the table and saying, hey folks, what's going on? And they say, Judge, my opponent is cheating. I would like you to disqualify them. Other times they're just like, hey, we're not sure what has happened. And you're like, okay, that doesn't help me a whole lot. And they're like, so I have 22 damage on my base. My opponent has 23. Also, we think maybe somebody drew an extra card at some point, and I don't understand what's going on. Sometimes the players genuinely don't know what's going on, and they need your help to figure out the game state. Maybe they were in the middle of resolving a complicated sequence of actions. Something happened, there was a communication, and now they're no longer sure where they are in that process. And it's just a mystery of, can you tell us where we are in our game? Ask clarifying questions to better understand what they need. As we talked about in the previous lesson, ask for clarification. Similarly, sometimes a player will just go into a story, and you're just like, hey, you're telling me a lot of stuff. Like if they're recounting every action that's happened in the last round, you might just be like, hey, before you go through that detail, what are you concerned about so I can listen for that piece of information? JFreak7 says, in my limited experience, they both want to explain their side first, since that sets the initial story. Do you choose one player to listen to first? Which one? Even if it's just, whose action is it, or something like that. I don't think I have a rule one way or the other. It's very much vibes based. I think that a lot of the time, I go to the player who I saw call for a judge, the person who instigated the judge call. It's also sometimes just the player that I'm facing, because it's easier for me to talk to them first and just be like, hey, when I show up to the table, I'm like, hey folks, what's going on? One person will start talking, and I will generally listen to that person first. There's absolutely some value in being the first person getting the story out, right? First impressions matter, but there's also a lot of value in getting the last word, and being clear that I'm going to listen to both of you, and just showing up and being like, I'm going to listen to you, and then I'm going to listen to you, I think generally handles a lot of those situations. I think frequently it's hard, like, I want to, generally, I think the person that called the judge is the person that I want to listen to first, because they have a concern that they're raising, right? If they both call judge together, or it's hard to determine who called for a judge, pick one of them. But one player is the aggrieved party most of the time, or one player is the concerned party, and so I generally listen to that person first, rather than the person who wants to defend themselves from that concern, because I need to know what the concern is before I can understand what's happening. If one person just says, I didn't do any of what he says or what my opponent's going to say that I did, that's not helpful for me. I need to know the accusation or the concern before I dive in. And the person calling the judge generally has that concern better understood. Now, if it's non-empirical, if it's not like I'm telling you what the comprehensive rules are, I'm not reading a card to you, and this is going back to the slide itself, get the other player's perspective. Ask them if there's anything that they missed. Ask them if there's anything they'd like to add. Many times in contentious situations, players do want to add something. in non-contentious situations, there's a lot of no, and there's some amount of yes, I just want to repeat what my opponent said, and you're like, okay, great, get it over with. But that act of listening and engaging with them is very important, and sometimes they do say something that is very helpful. Now, in the lesson itself, I cover a lot of different scenarios and questions that you might ask. It is a trained skill over time where you'll learn what questions get you the information that you want. When you're handling these situations, the way to think about it is, what answer do I want to hear from the player? I want to hear, did I say the name Maul or did I say the name Darth Maul? Because that's important, because those are two different card names. And that's the answer I want to hear, and so I need to ask a question for that. For this, it's a pretty straightforward question. Did you say Maul or did you say Darth Maul? But always, when you're trying to get information, figure out what answer you want to hear or what format you want to hear the answer in, and then go to the question. Next up, we're going to talk about how to provide better service. As mentioned, the atmosphere can change over time. It can sometimes calm down, and you should accordingly relax. Sometimes it gets a little bit more intense, and you may need to separate players. You may want to discuss strategic information, and that's actually pretty frequent. And if so, you're going to separate the players while doing so. Something that I find incredibly valuable, particularly for more contentious situations or situations where I'm trying to piece together the game, is, particularly if I have other judges on staff, ask the player to step away from the table, have a judge stand with them, and I sit down in their seat and talk to their opponent. Sitting in the actual seat and grabbing the cards and looking at the board state from the player's perspective does so much for the way my brain works. At the very least, I'm able to evaluate the game state so much faster when I'm in the seat as a player as opposed to diagonal and watching as a spectator. I don't know why my brain works like that, but it's the player brain versus the spectator brain, at least for me. It also lets me look at their hand, look at their resources, look at their discard pile naturally, rather than being like asking the player, hey, can I see your discard pile? Hey, can I see your resources? Hey, can I see your hand? Plus, it allows me to have a conversation with the player where we can manipulate and refer to the game state as we discuss what happened. One of the important things about discussing strategic information is you can say, what were you thinking about on a previous turn when you made a decision? If we're trying to reconstruct damage to a base, or we're trying to reconstruct how many resources were expended to play various things, I can say, okay, what were you thinking last turn? Like if somebody's like, I'm not sure if I appropriately resourced or not, and neither is my opponent, I can say, okay, what did you play this turn? What were you thinking about playing this turn? What resources do you, like when we look at your hand, what cards were you thinking about? And having that hard information of the cards in front of them and being asked that direct question of what were you thinking about can jog their memory. Whereas if you just said, hey, what do you remember? Like, tell me exactly how many resources you had. They're like, I can't remember. That's the problem here. But if you say, what were you thinking about? They're like, well, I was remembering that I'd be able to play Vader next turn because I'd be going up to 7. I'm like, okay, well, you have 6 resources now. And if you were planning on playing Vader next turn, Cry 7, that probably meant that you had 6 this turn and you need to resource now. But that's not a conversation you can have in front of the opponent. Now, for the question itself, as you're answering it, for a rules question, answer the question. For an infraction where something has gone wrong, I break it down into several steps. First, I summarize the events. I say, okay, so what happened here is you went to your regroup phase, you drew 3 cards instead of 2, and you added them to your hand. Is that correct? And this gives me one last chance for one of the players to say, hey, you're incorrect in what happened. My narrative is a little bit different. It wasn't during my regroup. I drew 3 cards during the action phase for whatever reason. This isn't regroup. And I'm like, oh, okay, that may change something, or maybe it doesn't. But it gives me one last check to make sure that everything's all lined up and that everybody agrees on what happened. Sometimes the players don't agree with you, but they're like, I understand that the point of this judge call is that we disagree on reality and you have to pick one reality. I accept that that is a plausible reality. For an infraction, identify what the infraction is and who committed it. This is important to be very verbal about. You've caused a minor gameplay disruption by playing Darth Vader for 6 resources or something along those lines. Then let them know what penalty they've earned. This isn't I'm giving you or I'm choosing to give you a warning. It's you've earned one. Policy says this is what you take this action, you get this penalty. It's a rule of the game that if you break the rule, you get a penalty. This isn't a choice that you're making. This isn't a condemnation of them as a player. It's simply a game rule, and so it's not something that they should internalize. They will internalize it. It'll stress them out. It'll bother them a whole lot. There's not a ton you can do about it. And like this language difference doesn't sound like it's huge, but just being like, hey, it's part of the game. It happens to everybody. I've received warnings. It's nothing to worry about unless you make a habit out of it, is a great way to make players feel at least a little bit better. Then you get into what the fix is. When you're talking about the fix, again, remind them, don't do anything until I instruct you to do so. We're going to go over the fix, make sure that everybody agrees on the fix before we move on. That way, if cards are changing zones, information is being revealed, and that sort of thing, if somebody ends up not agreeing with the fix that you propose, they have the ability to appeal or say, Judge, I don't agree because there's this extra piece of information that I haven't given you yet, or because I misunderstand the tournament rules, or because it's just really bad for me and I wish that I didn't have to reveal my hand. Finally, you're going to want to be prepared for an appeal. Sometimes a player is not going to be happy with your ruling for whatever reason, and they may ask to appeal. If you're on your own, you are the final authority, you are the head judge. Even if you're not on your own, you can sometimes read the player. Sometimes a player will very quickly snap off from appeal and be like, Judge, I disagree with you, I'd like to appeal, I want you to get the head judge now. This has to occur after you've completed your ruling, but it's acceptable for them to be a little bit short if they're confident that your ruling is incorrect. You can try explaining again or using the rules as your source. Sometimes a player will be like, Judge, I know that I read in the comprehensive rules, or can you show it to me in the comprehensive rules? And if you're comfortable, you can pull up the comprehensive rules and just say, see, here's where it says that triggers for events resolve after the event has triggered. Or you can bring the head judge to them if you're not the head judge and say, Head judge, here's the situation. When you're being appealed, the most important thing to communicate to your head judge right at the beginning is first, let them know that it's an appeal. This lets them know that it is a contentious live call, and so that it is a high priority for them. The next thing that you want to do is let them know the point of contention, why the player is appealing. Sometimes the player isn't happy with the fix, sometimes they're not happy with the penalty, sometimes they disagree on your reality, sometimes they disagree on the time extension. That, like when you're trying to figure out what the player is concerned about during the initial investigation, you want to be able to communicate what the appeal is about. I've had judges explain to me a gameplay error, gameplay disruption in detail that took a couple of minutes, explained the fix, and I'm like, okay, so what's the player's concern? This all sounds good to me. They're like, oh, they want a 5-minute extension instead of a 3-minute extension. I'm like, cool, your ruling was irrelevant to that concern. We've wasted a couple of minutes of time. So when you're dealing with an appeal, just go straight to the point of contention so that the head judge knows what information that they need to be looking out for. A lot of the time, a player just wants to hear a second point of view or be listened to. If you're the only judge, you can say, hey, let's talk away from the table real quick. Or if you've already had conversation and gone back and forth a couple of times, say, my ruling is final. I need you to continue playing your match, but I'm more than happy to discuss this after your match or after the event. And at that point in time, I can show you the rules and the comprehensive rules. However, digging it up at this point in time would add several minutes, and we're already deep into this call. I am confident in my ruling. I need you to continue playing. We can discuss it more later. Once the call is finalized, you execute the remedy, you issue an appropriate time extension, and issue the appropriate penalties. In summary, to go through this list, 1, when you hear a judge call, locate the call and make contact with the players. You check the time on the clock. You arrive at the call and evaluate the atmosphere. You listen to both players, work through the situation, issue your ruling, and if it's a policy thing, you describe the error, explain the infraction, explain the penalty and the fix, then determine if there are further questions or an appeal. You then apply the fix if applicable, and then issue time extension and penalty if applicable. Alrighty, that wraps us up. I kind of blitzed through that last section. I really recommend, if you haven't yet and you're interested in delving into a little bit more, going into this lesson. The judge call, taking a judge call lesson is one of the longer lessons, and I go into a little bit more a lot more detail than I do even in this live broadcast. It, I think, is the longest lesson to date, at least by sheer word count. It might go a little bit faster because I'm just rambling, and that's one of my specialties. But thank you so much for joining me today. I'll see you on Friday as we discuss using not MTG Melee, it's Melee.gg. Again, those old reflexes stuck in my head. Tennessee Feet Monk, so when can we expect that face-to-face PQ tournament report? Probably tomorrow. I still need to make sure that the Melee lesson gets updated and published and all that good stuff, but putting together that tournament report is on my to-do list. There was nothing crazy there. We played 7 rounds. There was a lot of Boba. Boba won. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to cut this short. I normally have a little bit of time for questions, but this was close to 2 hours, which is a little bit longer than our normal broadcast. So I'll see you all on Friday. Thanks for showing up. Have a good one.